Good evening, everyone. It's great to see such a large crowd tonight, such a nice crowd of smiling people. My name is Nicholas Manousis. I'm the president of the Horological Society of New York, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to our October meeting. As usual, we have a couple announcements before we get on with the lecture. I met a couple new members before we got started. And I want to especially welcome those new members. If there are any other new members that I have not met, please come see me after the lecture and I'll get you your lapel pin. I really especially want to welcome Mark, who just started his first day at the Patek Philippe watchmaking school today, which is pretty big news. Let's give Mark a hand. That's pretty cool. Oh, Jeremy, welcome. It's great to have you here. Let's give you a hand as well. Okay. So we have a couple new traveling education dates to announce. The weekend of October 21st, we'll be going to San Francisco. And for the first time ever, we're going to offer the traveling education courses here in New York City, the weekend of October 27th. So it's kind of, maybe we have to think of a new name for it because it's not really traveling since it's here in New York, but we're going to be offering our half-day horological education courses. October 27th and 28th, going to be a lot of fun. Actually, that date's wrong, right? It's October 28th and 29th. Okay. Thank you, Vincent. And Vincent is seated in the back there. Vincent is our director of traveling education, and he's often on the road when we're giving a lecture. So it's really nice, Vincent, to see you here, and thank you for all that you do for the society. Yeah. Thank you, John. So tonight's lecture, we're here in New York City. And I'm sure that most people in this room are familiar with Canal Street. You can walk down Canal Street and you'll see a wide range of fake watches for sale, right? It's well known. You can just walk down Canal Street. People will offer you fake watches. You'll see them in the stores there for sale. And what's not well known is the history of fake watches in general. When and where this phenomenon of fake watches started, how it is impacting our industry, how it has impacted it in the past, how it continues to impact our industry. And that's exactly what we're going to explore tonight. So our speaker for the evening is co-founder of the Struthers London Watchmaking Studio. She's a fellow of the British Horological Institute. And she is the first person in British history to earn a Ph.D. in horology. And tonight she's going to be presenting her thesis research. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rebecca Struthers.
Cool. Hello and good evening, everyone. Firstly, thank you so much for having me here this evening. It's an honor to be here talking to you all. I also need to say a huge thank you to the British Museum. Now, the research I'm presenting tonight is underpinned by the most thorough forensic examination of these watches that has ever been conducted, and that would not have been possible without the incredible help of the curators of the Clock and Watch Department of the British Museum. So thanks to them, and also to my ever-patient husband, Craig, who is here this evening, carrying my bags. So thank you very much, Craig. To Craig. Cool. So this research in the 18th century where we start is actually from a time that London has been widely considered to be the home of watchmaking. It was the golden era of British watchmaking, with some of the most famous names like George Graham, John Harrison, John Ellicott, Arnold, Mudge, all working in the city in that era. And these were kind of small workshops, maybe 10 to 15 people in each, producing 1,000 to 2,000 watches a year. But the impact that those watches had on the world was phenomenal. But it was also another period of huge change in Britain. It was the Industrial Revolution. And with that, realistically speaking, real wages increased very little over the course of the Industrial Revolution. It's not until towards the end that we see living standards begin to improve. For much of it, we have an emerging middle class who had financial aspirations beyond their financial means. And when that combined with the improvements in mass production and scientific understanding of metals, that we kind of have the two come together to create an age of imitation. It wasn't just watches, it was jewelry, it was art, paintings, it was across the board. And that's how I found my way into this subject of watches. So I'm going to start off, if we go back to Victorian London. I first came across a document called the Petitions of the Watchmakers of Coventry. Now, this was written in 1817, and if you ever get a chance to get hold of a copy and read it, I strongly recommend it. It sheds an interesting light on the state of British watchmaking at the turn of the 19th century. So, as I mentioned earlier, this was the golden age of British watchmaking. If you wanted a watch made anywhere in the world, you wanted a London watch. But at the same time, we see a huge amount of deprivation in the industry, and that's shown in the Petition of the Watchmakers of Coventry. There's a chap called Josiah Bartholomew, who's interviewed quite early on. He was actually a member of the Committee for the Relief of Distressed Workmen, and in 1817 had spent the past 4 years working in Clerkenwell. He prepared a report on the present destitute state of the working classes in the watch and clock trade in London. And incredibly, he found upwards of 700 cases of destitute watchmakers needing financial support, and claims he had taken more than 1,200 applications. Now, this is very different to this golden era of British watchmaking that we're used to hearing stories about. He actually goes as far as to describe the situation, the living situation he found one casemaker in. And I'll read you his quote. He says, "I have seen some with hardly a rag to cover them, and children without shoes or stockings and in want of bread. I visited a family by the name of Britton, a watch case maker who had been employed at Coventry. He and his wife had 5 children. I found the wife and children in a room without a fire in the month of January last. Rolled up in one corner of the room was something in the shape of a bed on the floor. I believe only a bundle of straw and cloth without sheets and a thin cotton covering, which was all 7 had to sleep on." Now, when we think of John Harrison solving the longitude problem, when we think of George Graham making watches for King George, we don't see this other side of British watchmaking where things were clearly changing and people were clearly struggling. And there are 3 reoccurring themes that come out of the Petitions of the Watchmakers of Coventry, as around 100 of these watchmakers are interviewed as to what they claim the issues were. The first being depression caused by the war with France. We'd just come out of the Napoleonic Wars. War is a very costly thing. People didn't have the same sort of disposable incomes, and that had a knock-on effect. To go with that, there was heavy taxation. War needs to be paid for. So plate duties were increased on silver and precious metal goods, and this made British watches more expensive than they'd ever been before. And the real nail in the coffin for the British industry was that this was being met by foreign competition like we'd never experienced before. So just as our watches were getting more expensive than they'd ever been, foreign competition was appearing. Now, this is the first one of these watches that I ever came across, a chap called John Wilter. Now, I was actually working at an auction house at the time, and one of these watches came in for cataloguing, and I looked him up in Bailey, and this was all Bailey had to say about this watch. Now, I could tell straight away that this wasn't what I was used to looking at for an 18th century London-made watch. The style of the movement is different. The quality of the movement is very poor. The engraving is substandard, and the dial was an unusual design as well, which I'll show you some in a moment. But this was all he had to say. John Wilter, perhaps a fictitious name. And this man, it emerged, was one of our most prolific forgers. And this was part of a trade, of an industry that would, as I will argue today, go on to change the course of horological history. And this is all we knew about the people who were making them. The Dutch forgery represents, in my mind, a long overlooked part of our horological history. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't exciting, it was cheap, poor, shoddy quality, and represented the demise of my home industry. So tonight we'll be looking at how to identify these watches. I think it's quite important. We're also looking a bit at, through that, how and where they were possibly being produced, how they were being distributed, and then lastly we'll come back to the impact that had on the British trade. So, what is a Dutch forgery? Now, this is a term I very quickly came across being associated with these watches. It's a watch sign that's London-made and created in the Dutch style, which I'll define shortly, and yet I was reading that it was reportedly made in Switzerland, which made probably about as much sense to me then as it does to a lot of people now. But it's a really problematic term. Because number one, they're definitely not Dutch-made. We know that for a fact. The Dutch industry was far too small to sustain the numbers of these watches that we see being produced. It was also very expensive to manufacture in Holland. It was an import-export market, meaning these watches would have been far too expensive to be produced at the sort of prices that we see these watches appearing. And also, Dutch watchmakers were very good. Their standards were very high. The style was the same, but the quality was completely different. So we know they're not Dutch. And to add to that, kind of technically, they're not a forgery either. This whole kind of fictitious term that has evolved over the years. The name, say, John Wilter, for example, is stereotypical of these Dutch forgeries. And my particular area of interest is that they're not forging known makers. If you put the name George Graham on a watch, there's a very obvious reason why you're doing that. The name sells. It's a big money name. Who was John Wilter? No one knows. But then, of course, in this era before the internet, before marketing and mainstream media, what did makers' names really mean anyway? Unless you were in that watchmaker's direct circle, unless you were part of the gentry or royalty, the name meant nothing. But you did know the City of London. And that's the one thing that unites all of these watches. It's not even about the name. It was just the City of London that sold them. And with that, you can't fake the name of a person that doesn't exist. It's no different to a brand name now. If we look at this, calling them London when they weren't being London made, country of origin law doesn't come in until the 1970s in Europe. So these were being made 200 years before there was anything preventing this from legally happening. So forgery, fake, it doesn't really paint the true picture here. There's something else going on. So they might be deceptive, but they weren't illegal. And this is how they've developed their name. So you've got 3 examples of watches up here. The first on the left is a London-made watch by Thomas Windmills, famous maker. You can see the single-sided, if I get it up here, the single-sided balance cock there with one point of contact between the balance and the main plate. In the center here, we've got a genuine Dutch watch with a double-sided balance bridge pointed at 2 places here. This style was not used in London. We don't have London makers making in this style. This was very much a typically Dutch design. And at the end here, we have another one of my favorites, Harry Potter. Apparently was a watchmaker long before he was a wizard. Again, the double-sided balance bridge here. Dutch in design. This is very much a Dutch-style movement, and if it wasn't for the name London, that's what someone would assume. Next one would be the dials. So on the far left here, we've got Shore of London, very typical London dial there with a perfectly smooth round minute track. In the middle, we've got our Dutch watch here, made in The Hague, with what we call an arcaded minute track, which is the scalloping you can see around the edge of the dial there. And then again, on the far right here, the far right, you've got our Wilter London with this same scalloped edge, this same Dutch forgery type edge of the dial. And with that, we also have, I went ahead there. The quality I mentioned again. So these are 2 mainspring barrels that you can see here. The one on the left, the lid of that barrel was so thin. This was one of the ones I took apart at the British Museum. It was just riding loose on top of the arbor. There was no way that this was going to go back together again. And this really sort of inferior use of quality of gauges of metal and materials is really common again with these watches. And you can see some watchmaker in the past, this wasn't me, I must stress this, has decided to rectify this issue by just lead soldering the whole barrel shut. So this watch is completely useless now, and we just have to hope that the mainspring never breaks. So we've got some details there in the movement and the dial. We also see common ground with the cases. These kind of repoussé cases are very common with these watches, which is it's interesting because these are appearing kind of second half of the 18th century, early 19th, when in London the fashion for repoussé cases had gone out in the first half of the 18th century. We were into plain cases by then. So this was quite an old-fashioned style by the time it appears here. This is a rendition of The Abduction of Helen by Daniel Cochin. Now, he was a known maker. He was a French chap, a medalist, a very famous medalist, who worked in Geneva for a while. But with this, it's impossible to prove one way or another whether or not he was the one directly responsible for making these, or someone got hold of his dies and was continuing to use them after his death. We have no way of knowing that for sure. But there was a lot of previous assumption around these watches that they were cast. I'll show you why shortly. And also commenting on the quality. I mean, you can probably see the engraving there. Helen looks a little bit understandably surprised. I guess the quality isn't great, but it's with this repeated dismissal of these watches as being a serious part of our history that I think we've overlooked some of the credit that they should be due. I managed to locate a total of 8 of these cases. And you can see from the examples here of varying condition that clearly the engraving on the previous one here on the top right is not original. This is a watch that at some point was being worn probably daily and in someone's pocket. And when you have something in your pocket like a watch and you put your hands in your pocket, you play with them, don't you? And you end up wearing away the detail on that engraving, and before you know it, you end up with just smudges for faces. And clearly, at some point, a watchmaker decided to try and pick out the detail back in poor Helen's face again and not do the best job. You've got an example, particularly on the lower left there, in the lid of a box that went through sale at Christie's a few years ago. That's been customized later in the 19th century into soapstone box that originally would have been a watch case, and the detail is exceptional. Now, I started out training as a jeweler and silversmith before I moved into watchmaking, and to me, this whole idea around these cases being cast didn't make much sense. We see casting now as a bit of a cheat method to just almost 3D printing in metal, the precursor of that, something you get the finished shape there, you just polish it and it's good to go. But in the 18th century, casting was a fine art. It was incredibly difficult to achieve. This is before centrifugal casting. This is in the days where centrifugal casting was a man with a crucible and a chain swinging it round his head. It's a really skilled job. To create something of this scale using those techniques would have been incredibly costly and time-consuming. Whereas we had stamping and forming, which is far more common and was used to cheaply produce things of very high quality en masse. Now, the reason I think these were previously seen as cast, you can see from the inside of the case here, is you get the smooth back. Now, if this was stamped, you should get the negative design in the reverse. Makes sense. So I decided to subject these to X-ray and XRF scanning to see if there was anything that these cases could tell us about how they were being made. And you can see on the far right here, the X-ray, you'll be able to see some black, that's supposed to be the laser, black dots here. Now, you do get porosity in casting, but they're generally pinhead size bubbles. A bubble of that size is exactly what you'd expect to see in something that's been solder filled. So filled in with solder after it's been made. And if we go onto the XRF scan here, you can see peaks, where are we, for the lead and their mercury Hg, which are perfectly typical of what we would expect to see with silver lead solder in this era. So to make the watches feel heavier, make them more durable, rather than cast them, they were being stamped and then infilled with solder afterwards to give that smooth appearance on the inside and make them more durable. So a bit cheeky, but again, nothing illegal about them. But what can we see about kind of the how and the where of these watches being made? So all of this was a process of stripping these watches down to try and see any of these details, from the design of them to the hidden marks and signatures inside them. Who was John Wilter? My first question. And kind of this is through this examination of these 30 watches at the British Museum, I started looking for some of these clues. Now here we have, looking at the production now, two movements that look quite different at a glance. You wouldn't really immediately see these watches as being made in the same manufactory. One by Godfrey Poy and the other one by Tarts, another very common name of these watches. It's not until you actually break them down to look at the key location points for the pillars, for the balance, for the screws, that you realize that the plate layout is almost identical. Now, standardized mass manufacture didn't appear until the US, over here in America, by the likes of Waltham in the mid-19th century. What we see here is a different kind of mass production. It's achieved purely through the redistribution of labor. Again, here we have two watches by John Wilter. These two watches had never been paired before. I found one at the British Museum and the other one at the Museum of London. Now, these are a bit more what you'd expect to see by being the same maker, but there are so many of these watches. In London, we had 1,000 to 2,000 a year being made. There was far more of these going around. The London setup wasn't sufficient to create on this scale. And you also see these strange things, plate makers marks, which, for any of you familiar with working with Verge watches, underneath the dial, you often get hidden an initial, which is the closest thing we have to the person who originally made these watches. So the plates would have been blanked by one person, then passed on down a production line or around the workshop. And if you had a problem with those plates later on, you needed to get them back to the person that made them. And with these, I started to find connections between these different makers' names and different watches. Here we have some more examples here. We've got a Harry Potter again there. You've got this rather unusual Kronos design, Old Man Time here, repeated again and again and again. Alan Walker, Alan Walker, Alan Walker, Harry Potter. So clearly you had a small number of manufacturers making for a large number of makers. And these are the plate makers' marks here. So I've managed to get the dials of 52 of these watches at the British Museum. And out of those 52, 20 had these plate makers' marks. And out of those 20, those marks belong to just 7 plate makers. So this is starting to paint a picture here. You've got large numbers of watches being made by a relatively small number of places. In London, the same as in Holland, you have large numbers of watchmakers making very small production runs. And this isn't just something we see commonly with the movements. We see it in the way the dials are being made as well. So you've got a series of painted enamel dials here, 2 by Chandler and Son, one signed May, and the other one on a watch signed Sampson. Now, I've studied all of these dials physically in person, and they are almost certainly, if not by the same dial painter, then by the same studio. And you can see it in the little details, for example, the way we've got the sky painted here, our little birds, like a little M's, very detailed. And also this rather unusual tree stump here that you see appearing here again, that kind of looks like the Earth's opening up rather ominously between our beautiful courting couple here. So again, we've got these dials being made, a small number of people making large quantities. But where could they be? What does this kind of production process tell us about? Does it give us any clues as to who could have been making them? So I got this as a map from 1789 that I started plotting the sort of locations that we would expect that we know there were manufacturers of that level in Europe or watchmaking communities. Aside from London, we've got the Dutch Republic there. Just again, too expensive to produce it cheaply enough. Similarly in Paris, a very active, very strong group of watchmakers in Paris, but we're talking the likes of Lepine and Breguet. We're not talking the sort of people who would have been capable of making Dutch forgeries. And again, far too expensive. What we do see is this really interesting cluster appearing here. So assuming we're looking at what's going on the Swiss-French border, going into a little bit more detail about this, we come across this term here, a tablissage. Now, there's no direct translation for this, but it's basically a form of kind of a production line of watchmaking. And this was first attributed to Daniel Jean Richard, who became the first to attempt tablissage, manufacturing this in Switzerland in this style as early as 1712. And it was described as dividing labor between a number of skilled craftsmen, including finishers, chain makers, spring makers, and goldsmiths. And he brought in spare parts from Geneva for assembly in the mountains before eventually shifting complete production out into the mountains and the Swiss-French border. So as early as 1712, we have this contrast to the London style of making. Instead of having one watchmaker with maybe 5 to 10, 15 at the most apprentices with him, working with your case maker down the road, a dial maker down the road, chain maker, all working as a small community in similar areas, such as Clerkenwell, we have someone bringing everything in-house. And this is what we see kind of with this upscaling in production, this redistribution of labor, of bringing everyone into the same factory was a very new approach at this time. But even then, this still doesn't get round to why these watches have been made in the Dutch style and signed London. This was still a sticking point of my head. How does this actually, what evidence does this give us as to who was making these watches and why they were being produced in these unusual styles? So I started looking at spelling mistakes of all things. Really common on these watches to see these kind of spelling mistakes. And I found this really interesting, looking at it from a linguistics perspective. John Wilter, or John Wilter, as he's also seen spelt, windmills with a windmill, windemill, windmill. We've got a very clear kind of mix-up here going on between our V's and W's. Now, how could that be possible? Obviously, the V being very Teutonic in language, such as German or possibly Dutch, being interchanged with the W, which is an Arabic, more of an Arabic language tone, so Latin, such as French, for example. So are we possibly here seeing evidence of a language barrier between the people commissioning these watches and the people making them? So this is what got me thinking about what evidence do we have of this kind of interplay between different nations? And you see a little bit of this in the cases as well. Now, all these marks are on the same watch, made by or signed by Chandler and Son. And the two on the right are Dutch import marks, denoting imported silver into the Dutch Republic. The two on the left are actually full sets of genuine English hallmarks. Now, where would you go to learn a trade? You go to the best, don't you? So where would you want to go to learn about making watches? Is it possible you go to England, go to London at the time? Is there any chance that Londoners themselves could have played any part in the production of these forgeries, at least in the outset? This is something that I started looking into, and I went back to the petitions of the watchmakers of Coventry, see if there's any evidence of this in the interviews. And this is a dial maker, Mr. Richard Symes, and he's interviewed by the House of Commons, asking, do you understand that these dials that he was making were to be exported? He said yes. Without being made up into watches? He said yes. He said, do you know that the Dutch or any other foreigners procure any other articles in the watch trade? He says, yes, I know that they buy dials and also watch hands. So they've got an evidence here of Dutch merchants turning up in London, buying bits and pieces off London watchmakers. He said, of what description were they? And he replies, Dutch arch dials, with minute figures all around. I sold them 1 gross of Dutch arch dials. Our Dutch forgery dials, been made here in London, quoted in 1817. And were there any other references? There certainly were. There's another one here, and this is the closest I've come to finding the identity of our Wilter, at least in the outset. And you see a lot of this as well. Everyone knows someone who's doing something that they shouldn't, but no one's actually doing anything wrong themselves. That's another common theme here. This watchmaker, Henry Clark's friend, introduced the making of watches with a feigned name of Wilter's London. These watches were well made and would have done credit to the maker, who should have put his name on them. Other persons speedily imitated the external appearance of these watches and sent them to that same country, not specified. So it would appear that in its very early days, the demising English trade was actually playing a part in facilitating the production of these Dutch forgeries. It would appear that perhaps from these interviews that the English watchmakers were teaching Dutch merchants how to organize manufacturing, and that these Dutch merchants were then taking the skills and these production techniques over to Switzerland, along with their preferred home style. So if you've got Dutch merchants commissioning these watches, they're doing it in the style that they're familiar with back home. Could this be why they're in the Dutch style? So as to London and the names, what does any of this tell us about how they were distributed? So can this explain how the Dutch and the Swiss became such strong trading parties? Because this isn't something you really see covered in any other history of watchmaking, as the Swiss and the Dutch being busy mates, forging British watchmaking and founding the beginning of the Swiss industry as we know it today. This is not something personally I'd ever come across. But you see evidence in the watches here. Again, we've got more of these duty marks. Through on the left, you've got 2 from the Dutch Republic. On the right, you've got 2 from France. So you can see these watches, again, they're not being made in France, they're not being made in Holland, they're being made somewhere else, and they're being exported for sale. Now, if we go back to our map here. Now, I was doing a bit of side reading on the history of Toulon in War and Peace, because I'm really interesting like that, and came across a book by a chap called Malcolm Crook. He was looking at French shipbuilding in the port of Toulon, which is down here on the south coast. Now, Toulon, I promise this is going somewhere, Toulon was the perfect place for France to build its navy in the run-up to war with England. It was about as far away from Britain as you could possibly get. It was a natural cove and very easy to defend. The only problem with Toulon was it was also incredibly far from the best source of wood in Europe at the time for building ships, which was in the Dutch Republic, lo and behold. So the makers, the shipbuilders in France, were working with Dutch merchants to export this wood, but only the obvious problem to get from here around the coast, you're going through a little bit of an issue here when you're trying to build a fleet to go to war, or trying to get it past the British coast. So they had to try and get it across land. And Crook traced the movements of these Dutch merchants up and down across Europe by looking at Masonic ledgers, because that's where trade was happening. Every time they were traveling up and down, they were checking into the local lodges, doing more business and meeting. And he followed them along the Rhine-Rhone trans-European trade route, which virtually naturally connects the North Sea and the Mediterranean. Now, this only gets really striking when you put the two on the map together. So this was one of the busiest trading highways for Dutch merchants during the 18th and 19th century. Now, that to me says an awful lot. So you've got Dutch merchants with high-volume, low-value cargo like wood traveling down and taking payment with high-value, low-volume cargo like olive oil and brandy on the way back up. Were they doing a bit of business en route? Would a merchant be doing business at every given opportunity to make a bit of extra cash? It makes a lot of sense to me. And this trade was hugely successful, and the production of Dutch forgeries moved entirely to Switzerland, cutting out Britain completely by the end of the 18th century. The industry back in London was beginning to struggle. And the impact on the London trade, already hit by depression and high taxes used to fund the war, just could not compete with what was going on the continent. The situation became so desperate that watch and clock makers began petitioning the government, and this is where we see a paper trail starting to be created in the archives that we can follow. There are some price comparisons recorded in the Clockmakers Company ledgers here of the differences in case prices of precious metal for these watches. At the top here, you've got the Swiss-British, coming in at a lower depreciated gold content of around £4.09. compared to the British, including duty, of £9.14. They were talking half the price of anything that the Brits could make, and we just couldn't keep up. And it's shown in things like we've got here the Assay Office records at the London Assay Office of this sharp decline you see between half the number of gold cases going through year on year between 1796 and 97, 20,000 less silver cases. Again, things were clearly getting desperate here. And at the same time, in 1793, we have the firm of Japy in Neuchâtel, who's supplying, as archives say, 40,000 movements for manufacturers in the Swiss mountains. Now, this is what I'm talking about when we say early mass manufacturing. And the modern scheme of things, 40,000 isn't a lot. It certainly doesn't compare to the millions of watches that Waltham were making a century later. But compared to what's going on in London, 1,500 watches a year, suddenly stepped up to 40,000. This is a completely different dynamic in the watch industry, and it proved this market that cheap watches would sell, and there was a market there ready and waiting to buy them. Now, in the same year, 1793, saw the founding of a new movement manufactory in Fontaine-Melon. By 1800, this factory had grown considerably in size and supplied a large number of skilled workers in the local area and financed by large volumes of commissions from both home and abroad. Now, the ledgers of this company show their earliest clients were predominantly local, and catalogues show the most popular styles commissioned by these fellow Swiss companies were given interesting names such as the superfine English and French styles. Now, this production method was highly successful, and the factory was acquired by a Jacob Robert Tissot in 1821. By 1880, it employed 400 people manufacturing 240,000 movements a year. And then it was sold and renamed to Fabrique de Horlogerie de Fontaine-Melon, or FHF as it's now known, and part of the Swatch Group. Now, obviously that's circumstantial, because none of these watches were being signed with their genuine names, so it's impossible to say what exactly these watches were like and whether or not this could be one of our sources of these Dutch forgeries. But judging by their own archives that they were making in the styles of different countries for export, it's down there in black and white that the Swiss industry was started off by, well, finance in its early days, making watches under feigned names or feigned locations for different watchmakers. So as I come towards the end of this presentation, this I'm hoping you recognize from the style of the balance bridge here is another one of our Dutch forgeries. Now, this has been a really brief overview. As you can imagine, this ended up being quite a body of work. But it kind of shows, I hope, now that our little Dutch forgery is not quite so Dutch or as much of a forgery as it had previously been considered. And while these watches have been long condemned to the dark corners of horological history for being cheap, for being poorly made, they made absolutely no contribution whatsoever towards things like accuracy, functionality, or reliability, which is what we prize so much in this industry. But in my mind, they did play a fundamental part in triggering a state of decline in the British industry from which it never recovered. Over 100 years, they turned the watch into one of the most exclusive symbols of status and wealth, into being a more affordable accessory. They demonstrated the market for affordable watches, and that, combined with advancements in machine production and the perfection of standardization here in America in the mid-19th century, made portable timekeeping accessible to all. And their contribution for that, I think, is not something that we should ignore for any longer. Ultimately, cheap and cheerful though they may be, these watches changed the course of horological history and should be recognized, in my mind, for their significance. I always love the underdog. So with that, thank you for providing us my lovely images this evening, and open to questions.
All right, if anybody has some questions for Dr. Struthers, raise your hand and I'll bring the microphone to you.
All right, a genuine repoussé should have the opposite image in the inside, right, of the case.
You usually see the negative.
Right, I've seen many of those.
Yeah.
Now, what was the reason for putting the solder in to cover that up? Was it because the quality of the metal they were using for the repoussé was very cheap and thin?
It
Sort
was, yeah, both cheap and thin, and these watches were being far more heavily used than you would have expected of a more luxurious watch. So they were being used for daily wear. The material was thinner, and they wanted them to feel heavier. It was about making something feel more expensive.
All right. This style of balance cock was also done by the French. What was the difference between the Dutch fake and the French balance cock? It is very similar in design. That's what I want to...
It's got a 2 foot, 2 feet the same as this one, but those feet are almost completely hidden underneath the table of the balance bridge. So it is, if you, unfortunately I don't have one in this presentation, but they are aesthetically very different to look at. So the feet here, rather than sticking out,
Right.
are hidden underneath here and underneath here, and it almost looks like a circle floating on the metal.
Oh, that's right.
And they don't use as much of the scrolling as well either. It's far more plain, more simplistic in that kind of pre-Breguet sort of style.
You know, the fake watches were also done here in the United States by Swiss. We call them Swiss fakes.
Yeah.
Trying to break into the American market back when you said Waltham and Elgin were around. And the misspelling was also carried out on there.
Yeah.
And also weird names like United States Watch Factory, watch company.
I've got
That
a couple at home.
That I know
They're
is a
great,
fake
yeah.
company.
Yeah. Cool.
First of all, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In all of the fakes that you've examined, currently it's still a problem, of course, and one of the giveaways is you'll often find 2 counterfeit watches with the same serial number. And I wonder if you've bumped into that with any of the watches that you've seen.
No, it's not something, but to be fair, they're 250 years old, and if you look at a really famous maker like Thomas Tompion, his watches would have been kept and preserved, and yet we see it's about 15% of his watches, 20% have actually survived. So these were cheap, cheerful, disposable things. So many of them will have been lost over the course of history. It's kind of hard to pair up the numbers. And also because they haven't been treated with a huge deal of respect, I started going through auction catalogues and archives trying to collect as many makers, and I ended up with hundreds of them. But they're so rarely they photographed or given full descriptions, so you don't know what the numbers are, and then you don't know if you're seeing the same watch being repeated, and so it can make it really, really hard to tell when looking back. But I think it wasn't something they really had to do because there was nothing illegal about what they were doing. You kind of feel like they were hiding in plain sight in many ways. Why bother faking serial numbers if no one's checking on you and there's nothing they can do to stop you anyway, I suppose. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Make it up. Like they made up their names.
Hi. Again, I want to echo John's comment. Thank you very much. This was an awesome lecture.
Thank you.
A few years ago, I read an article about, it was a study of language that used dime store novels to try to study language and the history of language. And the argument was made at the time that by not studying the peak of artistry of language, you're actually getting a better historical look at what real language was like. And I wonder if something similar could be said for these type of watches. Maybe it's telling you something about the manufacturing that's more interesting and relevant for the larger scale society than what Breguet and Lepine were doing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of, we ignore the cheap and cheerful because it is less technically exciting, because it's less glorious for us to look at, and particularly as British researchers, this represents quite a dark part of our own history. It's not something we want to shout about, and the same for the Swiss, really. This isn't something that, you want to be proud of how your industry started. But when we think about the watch going from its early days of portable, accurate timekeeping being accessible to only the very wealthiest in society, to by the end of the 19th century and anyone could have a watch, access to portable, accurate time, it could change the world and the way we respond to just travel, to our working days, and this played such a huge part in the early production of accessible time. And I completely agree. Yeah. Yes.
On these fake watches, I'm sorry. On these fakes, Now we can identify different eras for watches based on pillars and other artifacts, because sometimes a maker's name was unknown, whether it was original or fake, we don't know. But were the designs of the pillars similar to those watches in that time frame, or they were cheaply made? An example is that watches from the 1700s have a lot of scroll work near the pillars, and they have what's called the Egyptian-style pillars.
Yeah.
So were they different?
These were typically five-sided baluster pillars, which again weren't that common in the British industry.
So
We
it's
were using
five-sided.
round, five-sided baluster. So you got that tapered form to
Right,
them.
right.
Yeah, which it's not very British style either, to be honest. We were using round pillars by that stage.
Right. We would be using them in about 17, I think it's 1730s, somewhere around there they started using them. But I'm talking about the earlier watches where they did use those Egyptian-style pillars. Now, you said they were five-sided. The English was four-sided, right? So were there any differences? And my other question is, were the chains also different?
In terms of the pillars, the Dutch forgeries start appearing in around 1750. So by then, we're kind of looking at round British pillars, and we'd stop using your tulip and your Egyptian pillars by then. So they were different to what was going on in London by 1750. The chains, quite similar, just not very well made, very light gauges of material. And these watches are generally very heavily worn, have been repaired a lot of times, very badly as well, which I think says a lot about the sort of people who were buying them couldn't necessarily afford to maintain them by going to the best watchmakers to get them repaired. So you do see a common theme running through the watches.
So you've actually seen I mean, I do a lot of repairs on chains. So, yeah. Oh. So I've done a lot of repairs on chains. I've not seen chains that were made very cheaply or very thin like you're describing. Were they that cheap or very noticeable? I mean, did you actually see them?
The chains,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, they break more commonly. I think probably part of it is to do with the sort of steels that they were using as well. So it didn't XRF scan the chains, just the cases, to compare the sort of steel composites being used on the continent as opposed to in the UK. But it was known that they used a lot of metal depreciation to cut costs.
Dr. Struthers, have you heard any reaction from the Swiss watchmaking industry to your research?
No. And I haven't published this too widely yet, so who knows what might happen. And I mean, a lot of it is circumstantial because nothing was being genuinely signed, so it does make it difficult. But we do see the evidence of the numbers being made compared to what was going on in London, the fact they're being listed in the ledgers as being made in the styles of other countries specifically for export. It is rather telling, especially when you combine that to this Dutch trade route across Europe and where we see these watches suddenly cropping up. It would appear there's definitely a bit of a pattern there, I think. Yeah.
Any other questions for Dr. Struthers? Yes.
Thanks again so much for your talk. I'm curious about the people who are buying these watches. Were they being represented as legitimate? Were people overpaying? Were they aware of what they were getting? And also, I'm curious how that might have impacted the demand for the genuine London watches at the time. I know the industry was in bad shape, as you said, but did you find any evidence that this may have been part of a deliberative manufacturing process to undermine the London industry, to take away confidence in order to take it over?
I think, well, they were definitely trying to take the industry. I think that's very apparent. They were trying to put us out of business, so they move manufacturing completely abroad. Yeah, I mean, sorry, I've forgotten the first part of your question. Oh, who was buying them? I did quite a lot of research on this age of imitation that I ended up cutting out of this because I was already trying to fit so much in. It was described, I've seen it described as a willful ignorance. And it is because you have this very little by way of a real wage increase over the course of industrial revolution, and you've got this new emerging middle class in Britain who are seeing all these beautiful things on wealthy people but can't quite afford them themselves yet. And then you see kind of the market responding to that. So something like Sheffield plate, for example, was still quite expensive, but it was a lot cheaper than real silver. And if you look at the electroplated marks that you get on Sheffield plate, are designed to look like silver hallmarks. So when you've got your beautiful salver for your dinner and you whisk it away quickly before your guests notice that it's not real silver, it gives the appearance that you're a lot more wealthy than you actually are. It's very clear. And same with paste and cut steel to replicate diamonds. I think it probably was a very similar situation to when you're going down your market on Canal Street, I think it was, and you're seeing a Rolex watch for, I don't know, $50. You know you're not getting the real thing, really. But, you know, if it looks the part and you can then play that sort of game within that social circle, it was an incredibly socially competitive time, the 18th century. It was very much an age of keeping up with the Joneses. Yeah.
I wonder, I read your bio before your talk this evening, and I understand you live here in the States?
No.
I misunderstood then. My question really is, if you could explain a little bit about the politics or the challenges of talking a university into granting a doctorate in horology, and what advice you could give to somebody who would like to try to do the same here stateside.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge I faced was that watchmakers traditionally tend to stick to making, and the people who research the history of horology are generally historians. So people who try and bridge the two, well, it hasn't really happened much until now. And there was a lot of disbelief that the subject was worthy of academic study at this level. And it did take a lot of fighting to get it through approval to even be allowed to study the Ph.D. in the first place, let alone... But actually, by the time I got to my Viva, it was all really good. And I think it was appreciated because people could see the value in what was being done here. I think watchmakers can make an incredible contribution to the history of material culture, because realistically speaking, unless you're a trained watchmaker, the majority of the photos I've shown you within the movements here, you would never have access to these bits of history. It takes the skills of a watchmaker to get inside these pieces and read them, almost like you would do a book. So we can allow access to what are incredibly important pieces of history. Watches were an incredibly exclusive status symbol, but they're also incredibly sentimental, personal things that we you have evidence of, say, like Puritan watches and hiding messages within watches and hiding allegiances to, whether it's political or in that case, yeah, with the Royalists and the Puritans. But they are incredibly important, and if watchmakers can help shed light on the mechanics and the internals of these pieces, so we can now fit them into the larger story of material culture in the 18th century, I think it's an incredibly valuable contribution. And fortunately, my examiners agreed. And I think there's still so much scope, because it's never really been done before. It was actually quite straightforward to find areas I could make a contribution to knowledge, because no one's been trying to do this in this way before. So I think hopefully precedent set. It should be more straightforward for others to do the same. And I think I hope now it's been demonstrated that how much value you can bring to the subject. So just go for it. Get ready to argue and go for it.
Okay, maybe we have time for one more question.
You had mentioned earlier on that of a book about watchmakers in Coventry. What was the title of that book? Who was the author? And are there any more books like it that looks into the lives of watchmakers?
Yeah, it's the Petition to the Watchmakers of Coventry from 1817, and it's a government petition. So we have these watchmakers turning up at the House of Commons in 1817 to go through a series of interviews, complaining to the government, that's what they're there for, complaining to the government about all the things going wrong and what changes they want to see being made. And there's a response to that as well that follows on from the government back to them about laws they're looking to introduce now. So much of it is archival as well. So you've got records with the Clockmakers Company and also at Goldsmiths Hall. A lot of it is getting physical, your hands on these things. So if you're ever over in London, I'll point you in the right direction for a few. But they are there. And I spent a few days at the Guildhall Library at Goldsmiths Hall with the letters, original signed letters signed by Arnold. And it's a beautiful thing to handle. But you see this kind of the backwards and forwards between clockmakers, goldsmiths, and the government. And yeah, it's quite a telling story. Yeah, cool.
All right, let's give Dr. Struthers another hand.